Hello and welcome to iGCSE Success. If you're new here, welcome to my channel. I'm an English teacher. Presently I'm teaching at an international school and I teach year 7 all the way through to year 13. I have no idea what I'm doing with my hand. And I teach both English language iGCSE and English literature iGCSE, and I've been doing it for about 8 years now. However, this channel is primarily geared towards first language English, so if you are looking for a channel which offers tips and tricks and guidance to ensure you guys get that top grade that no doubt you deserve, stick around. So I'm going to be doing a 3-part series looking at the core skills of the English language paper. I'm going to start with the writer's effect question, then move on to the directed writing question, and then finish with that dreadful summary question, which is still worth 15 marks. Now, I have done quite a few videos on the writer's effect question. Please do check them out if you haven't done so already. But it was really just me talking to the camera, and I've got pretty good at editing videos now, so I will try and put some magical things here to make it easier for you guys to follow. Now, the writer's effect question, sometimes referred to as the imagery question or the language analysis question, or that really difficult question that students just struggle with. So those of you who have completed the 2020 specimen paper, because there's only one out there, you would have noticed that there are a few changes to this question. There are more marks available, so you can now get the maximum of 15 marks. You still have to write between 200 and 300 words, but I guess the most significant difference is that you only need to analyze 6 powerful words, images, phrases in total. And just in case you haven't attempted a slightly older paper, it used to be that you were required to analyse 4 from each paragraph. So let's begin by looking at what skills you need to demonstrate in order to be successful with this particular question. So as mentioned, you are directed to 2 different paragraphs, and it's usually from a piece of fiction. You then need to find 3 powerful words, images, phrases from each paragraph. So that's 6 in total. Cambridge essentially want to see a student's ability in able to understand language, understand how language works, the nuts and bolts of the English language, if you like, and also the ability to be able to make confident inferences and to explore different shades of meaning. And that's kind of why it's quite a tricky question. Analysing language and being able to comment on what a writer is trying to convey through their work, through their writing, is a difficult skill for any student. And just remember that when we form opinions about a text, about characters, about ideas, they all come from the language that the writer uses. So it's just a matter of getting those ideas and putting them into 2 nice paragraphs, and there's certainly steps that I can give you to make that process a little bit easier. Now, if you're new to the first language course, you might be wondering, well, what does the question actually look like? Well, I will try and upload the 2020 specimen paper somewhere around here. And although the primary focus is imagery and always has been imagery, there are a number of things that you can comment on and you will receive credit for. So let's look at some of these things. Let's start with imagery. Now, if you've watched my previous videos, you'll know that I've referred to this as an umbrella term. There's lots of things that go underneath that umbrella. When we refer to imagery, we refer to any kind of powerful words and images that create these visual images in our heads. So when you comment on metaphors, similes, personification, onomatopoeia, or any kind of sensory details or descriptions, you are commenting on imagery. You can also focus on vocabulary and word level analysis. So things such as emotive language, hyperbole or exaggeration, and parts of speech. As a side note, it's really important that you know your word classes, and that's going to show the examiners that you know how language works. For example, do you know your adjectives from your nouns, your superlatives from your comparatives, your abstract nouns, for example? You can also comment on the sentence types the writer chooses to use: simple, compound, complex, and minor sentences. And of course, not forgetting the different sentence functions that there are. You may wish to comment on the imperatives, the declaratives, the interrogatives, or the exclamatives. You could also perhaps comment on the writer's use of punctuation and whether it has been used stylistically. So for example, the use of hyphens, ellipsis, exclamations, commas, etc. And of course, as you develop your skills, you may wish to look at other techniques such as sarcasm, humour, irony, foreshadowing. Now, one of the difficulties many students face, even if they can analyse language, even if they can make inferences, it's quite often the writing part of the response. So they can verbalise their ideas, but actually putting together a sophisticated academic response can be quite difficult sometimes. So what I use with my students, and what I have used for many years, and I've seen many students get brilliant results from using it, is what I call the 5 steps to success. Now, step 1 is all about understanding the overall effect, understanding what the writer is trying to achieve, what they're trying to convey to the reader. Students are often, in my experience anyway, they're quite hardwired to want to feature spot and to track the text and look for the metaphors and the similes and the personification without actually understanding the text first. So let's start by having a look at a piece of fiction and let's see if we can understand what the writer is trying to achieve through their writing. He staggered forward and gasped as he looked upon the trees. Whirring and howling, the branches looked desperate to escape their roots. The breeze surrounded him constantly, imploring him to move. It was a warning. The leaves were illuminated with glimpses of moonlight, and he felt drawn to them. He tried to escape, but his body was now frozen. The first thing he felt was the breath on his neck, then the hands around his face. The cold, sweaty hands were covered in soft leather. The grip tightened. Silence fell. Now, going back to step 1 and understanding what the writer is trying to achieve, their overall effect. Clearly, we are dealing with a character who's in this quite vulnerable situation. There's this element of danger, and that certainly is true come the end. Now, of course, that small paragraph is full of powerful words and images, but remember, you only need to choose 3. So these are the 3 that I've chosen. Now, the sentence starter that I ask my students to use for both paragraphs is always, the overall effect of the language creates an image of. That's the overall effect of the language creates an image of. Now you should be ready to write a really clear and concise sentence to show Cambridge that you understand what the writer is trying to achieve. This will usually include 1 or 2 abstract nouns to show how a character is feeling, for example. So I would probably write the following. The overall effect of the language creates an image of the character's desperation and vulnerability as they make their way through a seemingly dangerous environment. And notice the 2 abstract nouns which I've chosen to use, vulnerability and desperation. So step 2 is what I like to call a transition phrase. You might be thinking, okay, I've done my overall effect. How do I begin to include my evidence, and how do I ensure that my response has that fluidity to it? Something which I forgot to mention previously is that you want to try and highlight an image from the beginning, middle and end of the extract. So I recommend that you simply use the following phrase. The writer begins by describing. That's the writer begins by describing. Step 3 is where you embed your first quotation. Now, as a general rule of thumb, you want quotations that aren't too long, 2, 3, 4 words max. And really, the shorter the quotation is, the easier it will be to embed it within your sentence. Now, embedding quotations, I'm not going to lie, it can be quite tricky for some students, but it really is practice makes perfect. Now, when we analyse, it doesn't matter if it's language or literature, we want to analyse it using present tense, as if the story is happening now. And we call this literary present tense. Literary present tense. Now again, this can be quite tricky if a writer uses past tense verbs, but remember, it's as easy as changing the tense using square brackets. So taking my first quotation, you should end up with a sentence that reads something like this. The writer begins by describing the character staggering forward and gasping. That's the writer begins by describing the character staggering forward and gasping. And as another side note, if you are a student who is still using the word quote within your language or literature essays, please do, from an English teacher, break that habit right now. Unfortunately, whilst it may be easier to use the word quote or to simply not embed your quotations, Cambridge really appreciates students who can use textual evidence in a kind of seamless manner. Now, if you've watched my previous videos on the writer's effect question, you'll know that step 4 is what I like to call the zoom in technique. You don't need to zoom into every single word or phrase of the quotations you choose to use. It's an easy way to show the examiners that you know how language works. Obviously, the words staggered and gasped are the powerful words within that sentence. So quite simply, my next sentence is going to be the writer's use of the dynamic verbs. The writer's use of the dynamic verbs. Now step 5, of course, this is where you are going to get your marks from. And this is where you are required to use some sort of analytical verb or analytical phrase. And here are just a small selection of verbs or analytical phrases which you could use. However, I'm going to use create an image of to signpost where I'm about to begin my analysis. Now, as another general rule of thumb, you want a couple of sentences per image. Remember, you've only got 300 words, but don't just give one idea or one inference. 2 or 3 ideas is going to ensure you get those top marks. So I would analyse those verbs in the following way. The writer's use of the dynamic verbs creates an image of the character being in a threatening situation. It's clear that they are feeling terribly anxious and they are panicked by the thought of being followed or watched. And then guys, all you need to do is repeat steps 1 to 4. In terms of your transition phrase for your second quotation, I recommend simply using the writer then goes on to describe. That's the writer then goes on to describe. And for your last quotation, I would simply use lastly, the writer goes on to describe. So hopefully, if you manage to repeat steps 2 to 4 for both quotations, you should end up with a response which may read something like this. The overall effect of the language creates an image of the character's desperation and vulnerability as they make their way through a seemingly dangerous environment. The writer begins by describing the character staggering forward and gasping. The writer's use of the dynamic verbs creates an image of the character being in a threatening situation. It's clear that they are feeling terribly anxious and are panicked by the thought of being followed or watched. The writer then goes on to describe the breeze imploring him to move. The writer's use of personification here is particularly powerful as it heightens the tension and it makes it seem as though the environment is urging him to find an escape. The fact that the natural world is also brought to life creates an almost sinister tone to the writing, adding to the character's alarming situation. Lastly, the writer goes on to describe the character feeling a pair of cold and sweaty hands covering his face. The writer's use of imagery here is particularly shocking as the character's precarious situation finally gets revealed. It's now clear that the character has been closely watched all along and has now been captured by an unidentified man. And then of course you would move on to your second paragraph, and it's important to note that the overall effect would be different. And that's all from me guys. I hope this video has been useful. As always, if you have any questions, please do leave them below. My next video will be looking at the directed writing question. Until next time, bye bye.